You look at your agendas now. We're going to next have a presentation by the Authority Administrator, which is me. We'll be talking to you about the LESJWA accomplishment and the recent lake activities. First off, a little bit of background about LESJWA. We call it LESJWA. It's the Lake Elsinore and San Jacinto Watersheds Authority. It's a joint powers authority, as Bob mentioned, consisting of 5 member agencies: the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, the City of Canyon Lake, the City of Lake Elsinore, Riverside County, and Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District. LESJWA was formed back in the year 2000. We're a joint powers authority. These 5 agencies work together through this one organization to improve the water quality in Lake Elsinore and Canyon Lake and the San Jacinto watershed. The San Jacinto River watershed, for those who may not be aware, is very much a tie to these 2 lakes. It's about a 720 square mile area. And unlike many other lakes that you might be familiar with, Big Bear, Lake Arrowhead, and others, we're not surrounded by forests completely. We actually are mostly a developed, urbanized watershed. And when rainfall occurs, all that runoff from that big watershed flows into that small little lake, Canyon Lake. And when Canyon Lake overflows, it flows into Lake Elsinore. I'll describe both the lakes first. Canyon Lake, a little facts about this. Canyon Lake is actually about 300 acres, 363 acres. It has about 13.8 miles of shoreline. It's a recreational water body for the most part, but also what a lot of people aren't not aware of is that it's actually a drinking water reservoir. Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District receives about 10% of its water supply from this reservoir. It is a deeper lake, even though it's a smaller lake than Lake Elsinore. It's much deeper. Near the dam, it's close to 80 feet deep. On the average, about 30 to 40 feet deep. Let's see if it advances here. There we go. I see I have to press this hard enough here. Okay, Canyon Lake challenges. Canyon Lake has the challenges associated with stormwater runoff. Our big culprit here that causes so much of the problems is nutrients. As nutrients are carried under rainfall events and it's sometimes attached to the sediment that is carried in that water runoff, it carries the nutrients. The nutrients, as they flow into Canyon Lake and to Lake Elsinore, cause the growth of algae. The 2 nutrients of big concern are phosphorus and nitrogen. When these nutrients cause this algae to grow, we have algae blooms. Oftentimes with that, the die-off of algae depletes the oxygen and fish kills as well. Going on to further downstream, Lake Elsinore. Now, Lake Elsinore is unique in that it is the only natural freshwater lake in Southern California. A lot of people aren't aware of that. It is a natural sump of the entire watershed, about 3,000 surface acres, about 2 miles by 3 miles. If you imagine how big of a lake that is bordered by not just the city of Lake Elsinore, which is a lot of a common misconception, but actually the county of Riverside adjoins the lake as well. As Bob has mentioned, though, despite everything, it is a major destination for recreation. It is a diamond in the rough in that we have a tremendous asset here of natural beauty, a place where people can recreate and enjoy lots of different recreational opportunities, as well as the wildlife that congregate here. It's a part of the major flyway of birds as they cross through this Southern California area. But it faces challenges, as indicated here. We've had a history of drying out, and back in the 1950s, for example, the lake was completely dry. They used to have motorcycle races across the bottom of the lake. But then after big rainstorms, it fills back up. And it is a challenge to maintain this. It drops by evaporation every year, about 4.5 feet. And this watershed is very much tied to this lake, as I mentioned before, and affects the water quality. The challenges that we're seeing, as indicated here, are droughts and the algae blooms. The drought conditions also have a big impact. When we don't get enough rain, we don't get enough runoff, and it doesn't fill the lake, and it just keeps on dropping. And it can be a real challenge. And the other part, too, is say it rains too much. It can come in and actually flood out things. There's been a lot of work to help control those flood situations around the lake, and we've done a lot of work, and I'll describe some of that. Another challenge that we have as well, as you've heard about in the news over the past few years, are the algae blooms. And tied to that now is that we're recognizing that there are oftentimes a type of algae called blue-green algae, and it's also known as cyanobacteria. And when people actually ingest this, it can actually make you sick. And when the lake levels drop really low, the sun gets really hot, and the algae begins to die off, it actually can have some toxicity and toxins that exist, and we have to warn the public this is a natural lake, and be careful when you go out there to not ingest the algae. And also it can be toxic as well to animals. So it's a real challenge that we have for the lake, and these are some of the reactions that can occur when you ingest some of these toxin exposures. Recently in the news, as you might have heard, this was a real plague to Lake Elsinore last year. But as new runoff comes in, it begins to go away. And right now, actually, what we're seeing at the results are right now it's not impaired with these toxins. But conditions change, and it can be a real challenge to contain this. But overall, if we can control the algae, control the nutrients, then this in turn will get better. One of the big projects that were constructed several years ago, from 1988 to 1994, was known as the Lake Elsinore Management Project. This is actually under a separate JPA that was organized when they were able to obtain some federal funding. And what this did was actually reduce the surface area of the overall lake. At one time, the lake actually extended way into the back basin area. And this project basically constructed this curvilinear levee that reduced the surface area and allowed the lake to be better managed so that the water that we had available could be used to just maintain this smaller area of about 2 miles by 3 miles. The source of the water right now that we have, the primary source, if we don't have enough storm water, is recycled water, highly treated recycled water. And so that water comes in. Another big part of this project too, and the concern was the flooding. When the big rainstorms came and flooded it out to the adjacent areas, it became a real problem for those who lived around the lake. So we now have an outfall channel thanks to the support of the Riverside County Flood Control District. So LESJWA, getting back to LESJWA, what have we done to help out to improve the Canyon Lake and Lake Elsinore? When we first were formed back in 2000, we actually had some money assigned to us from a water bond that was passed, about $15 million. And we brought in the best experts in the country. They're called limnologists, lake experts. And we brought them in and said, okay, let's have a panel session and some in-depth analysis. What are the first things that we need to do? And we brought in this one professor, and his name was Dr. Dennis Cook, and he said, it'd be great if you started on the upper watershed, but the reality is you have a certain amount of money and that won't go that far. So what can we do? And I see you have this huge overpopulation of carp, and at the time we had just, tremendous numbers of carp within the lake. They basically threw the ecosystem out of balance. Carp also stir up the bottom of the lake and resuspend those nutrients and sediment back into the water, causing more algae blooms. So he said, first thing you need to do is get rid of that carp. So we actually brought in a company that did the netting necessary to remove the carp, and over a span of about 6 years, we removed over 1 million pounds of carp. Let's see. In addition, we also brought in better fish known as bass. At the time, we were required to use hybrid striped bass because they were concerned about bass in a big rainstorm event flowing down to the Santa Ana River and threatening some other threatened species. So we used hybrid striped bass, and we brought in several tons of fish on an annual basis of bass. The bass help control the fingerlings of the carp, but also another fish called shad. The shad was important to control because they feed on the zooplankton within the lake. And zooplankton are the ones that help control the algae. So you want lots of zooplankton. And so if the bass were eating up the shad and the carp fingerlings, a little more ecosystem balance within the lake. One of our major projects, and probably I would say the most important project that we were able to construct with the funding that we had, is the aeration and mixing system. This was a big project to do what we could do for Lake Elsinore. Lake Elsinore has actually a great deal of oxygen content at the surface. There's a lot of interplay with the atmosphere, and at the higher depths, it actually is pretty rich in oxygen. So we needed just simply more mixing. Imagine a big giant aquarium. You ever notice that every single aquarium has these things called aerators, and they push air into your aquarium and causes that mixing? We needed that mixing to occur, and also a little injection of air. So we have a dual system basically to first establish 2 compressors on both sides of the lake, and then perforated pipes that push air out from the bottom of the lake, and it actually bubbles up to the surface. We also have a separate system that actually pushes the higher oxygen water down. They're called axial flow pumps. They're at stations around the high-speed zone, and they push the high oxygen water down. So we have this dual system, and it works pretty well, and it does a pretty good job in reducing the frequency of fish kills and the severity of the algae blooms. It's not effective enough to say, guaranteed, you'll have no algae, you'll have no fish kills. It is a very effective system, but despite all our efforts, sometimes when the lake level drops, no matter what you do, you still might be threatened by some fish kills. Frankly, since we've had our system in, we haven't had the major fish kills that we had from years ago. Some minor fish kills, and the city has been very proactive in getting that cleaned up within a day, so you don't have the reporters coming out here and say, oh, look how bad it is. Moving on, as I mentioned before, one of the big sources of supply when we don't have enough rainfall is recycled water. Thanks to the support of the city of Lake Elsinore and Elsinore Valley, Minnesota, they pay to have that recycled water treated. And when I say treated, actually they reduce the nutrients within the water, and about 5 million gallons of water per day, recycled water, flows into Lake Elsinore. We actually built the permanent pipeline and also the improvements at Elsinore Valley's treatment plant, and paid for that from the funding to allow that water to flow to Lake Elsinore. Also, we're helping with Canyon Lake as well. There was a project that was constructed to remove the sediment. Canyon Lake, the Property Owners Association in the city said one of the main problems we have is in the East Bay, all that sediment is collecting and it's just filling up the East Bay, and boats are having a difficult time to move around. But also, if we can get that sediment removed, you're removing nutrients as well. We saw a benefit there, and so we removed about 20,000 cubic yards of silt from the East Bay area. In addition, in 2006, the regional board stepped in and said, we're required by EPA to address the impairment of water bodies, and water bodies we recognize are impaired are Lake Elsinore and Canyon Lake. And at that time, they cited certain individuals, not individual, but agencies in the upper watershed as being responsible in controlling those nutrients. They knew that the runoff from urban development, from various agricultural lands, dairies, many other sources, had to do something to control those nutrients. A lot of development was occurring. So we recognize that if each one of them, there's about 20 of them, were to do all this on their own, be a very, very expensive proposition. So LESJWA actually convened all of these entities and formed what is known as a task force. It's called the Lake Elsinore and Canyon Lake TMDL Task Force. And this is a great model. SAPA, the organization I work for, has used a task force format for many years, very successful. We were able to bring in consultants and contractors to assist us with the modeling, the studies, the monitoring that we needed to do to eventually develop implementation improvements for both lakes. A big part of that as well is that here's the list of all the agencies. A party to that task force is actually the Regional Water Quality Control Board themselves. They actually signed that agreement. And what's really remarkable about this is we have a tremendous collaboration with all these agencies. They meet on a monthly basis, as well as the Regional Board. The Regional Board staff actually attends our meetings each month. And we applaud that because that is very unusual in many other circumstances in other regions in Southern California throughout the state. They don't participate in a collaborative fashion as well as I think our region does. In fact, I would say one of the hallmarks of and reflections of that success is that there was actually a period of time for about 2 years, and we were monitoring on a regular basis Lake Elsinore, and we had been for many years, and we were putting a lot of money into monitoring, sampling at both lakes, and we knew and we understood what we needed to do now for Canyon Lake was to apply aluminum sulfate, a very effective means to actually filter out the nutrients from Canyon Lake. And they said, we know and recognize that can be expensive, and we approached them about a suggestion. The suggestion was, how about we hold off on the monitoring? I think we have a pretty good understanding of the quality and what happens. Hold off and take that funding and apply it to the alum. And they actually supported that. They said, okay, we're okay with that. Let's hold off on the monitoring for 2 years, take that money that you're saving and put it into the aluminum. What an amazing thing that a regional board was willing to work with this and not have to just simply spend money for perhaps something less effective as monitoring and use it for productive implementation of the aluminum sulfate application. That process is continuing today. We were able to get some grant funding that also helped to offset the costs. Basically, all those 20 agencies are the ones who are paying for this. This is that task force that are contributing to ongoing work to support Canyon Lake, and they apply this alum twice a year. This is a tremendous benefit, and we're seeing results. In fact, you get testimony from most of the residents around Canyon Lake, and they said, you know, the lake has never looked better than they've ever seen it since they've been around the lake. Reports of clarity down to 12 feet. It is definitely doing its job, and we're really pleased with the progress we're seeing there. Also, I want to emphasize, as I think I mentioned before, we're not a Big Bear Lake. Lake Elsinore and Canyon Lake, we're not Lake Tahoe. We are seeing some real benefits from the things that we're doing, but we're not mountain lakes. We don't have a natural forest around our individual lakes. So the lake improvements that we're doing seem sometimes like, what are you guys doing? And sometimes it's baby steps compared to, say, what you would expect in a Lake Tahoe. But I think what we're doing is as effective as we can with the money that we have. We're using the best technology and best support that we can to reduce the frequency and severity of those algae blooms at both lakes. This is very dependent upon funding. Right now, the city of Lake Elsinore and Elsinore Valley Meteorological District, as well as the county, they operate and maintain the operation system of the aeration system and the mixing system, but they also pay for the water, the recycled water, to be brought into the lake, and that amounts to close to $3 million per year. Those local entities are working hard on helping to support Lake Elsinore. And the upper watershed agencies as well, they put over $1 million per year to help with the necessary implementation. Again, the alum that's being applied in Canyon Lake, they pay for that. And we expect there'll be more necessary improvements as we move forward. So what's next for LESJWA? We see that we want to continue to make sure that we're watching out for algae toxins and the algae growth, looking at the nutrients that are coming in, seeing what we can do to support this effort and supplement the funding that we have to increase that. But another big part of what we're doing now is also looking at what is known as the total maximum daily loads. Things have changed. If you look at the upper watershed, more and more development has occurred since that was first established. Those total maximum daily loads put limits on the amount of nutrients from each of those who are discharging downstream. And so things have changed so much with the land use and also the regulations themselves. They're actually doing a TMDL update. That is a big effort, close to a $500,000 effort to update that. We have some consultants on board that are in that process. They're about to conclude that report now. It'll go through the regulatory process, being brought to the regional board, eventually to the state of California, and eventually to EPA. So that's a big effort that's going on right now. But we also anticipate that as time goes on, there may be additional projects that we can implement. Technologies are always changing, and we want to be on top of that to apply those as necessary to support both lakes. So with that, let's see, I think I got about 5 minutes. Be happy to answer any questions that people might have. Who's going to be brave here and ask the first question? Okay, well, with that, I'm glad that I answered every single person's question. So, one question, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned the aluminum part. How many tons of carbon
Out of Lake Elsinore, about 1.1 million pounds of carp. The number of carp there, it probably translates into about 300,000 fish. It's pretty amazing, you know, that we were able to do that. And you know, there may be a time in the future we might have to go back and do that again. It's just really something that we have to watch for, do fish surveys, look at the different types of fish that are there, making sure that we have a balance. If we begin to see more of that happening, where there's an overpopulation of the carp, then we might have to go back in. Right now, over the past few years, we haven't had to do that, and that's a good thing. So we're watching for that. Yes, sir, back.
There was some talk at one time about the back basin and having some type of a fishery back there to, you know, grow some bass, I think, you know, predatory to the carp.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever happened with that? Is that still something that's in the future?
You know, there hasn't been too much discussion about that. I recall that being proposed at one time. The challenge in the back basin is that, frankly, there's a lot of property that is being developed back there. There's about 300 acres that was set aside as a mitigation associated with the levee, and it was required by the Corps of Engineers. It's a wetlands, and we did some improvements to the wetlands to promote the growth of healthy zooplankton, as well as even the fish that might migrate back into those wetlands areas. But establishing a fishery has a lot of regulatory hurdles, and it's something that at this stage we haven't explored, but that is a possibility, that something we might do in the future. Jack, in back.
We're still testing the runoff from dairies and so on. I know at one time we had a pretty good program there.
Yes, we still do watershed testing. We have 3 main locations. They're not tied directly to the dairies. We recognize that actually, because of regulations that now are required of all dairies, they have to control the 25-year, 24-hour storms on site. So when they have big storm events, they have to sink it somehow or control it right there on their properties. That's all part of the confined animal facility requirements by the regional board. So frankly, a lot of the past problems with dairies is now being addressed by those regulations that they're required to follow. But we do have monitoring stations. We do like to know what's coming out from the watershed, and we do collect that on an annual basis. The challenge is, if you don't have rain, you don't have anything to monitor. And we've had this past year only 2 events that were big enough to actually go out and do monitoring and sampling and testing back at the labs. So it's something we are watching. So maybe one more question before I move on. Yes, sir.
Is it engines talking about a hydroelectric process or unit out here off the lake? Is that anywhere? Where is that?
Well, that's a very good question. And you know what? We have a whole presentation this afternoon that will be presented by Greg Kalin, and he'll go into details about that project. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to our next session. This will be a panel session among 3 parties. Hope Smythe, our executive officer of the regional board, Jason Yulee, general manager and chief engineer for the Riverside County Flood Control District, and Pat Bolt, the executive director of the Western Riverside County Ag Coalition. I invite you to note that you have blue cards right there on each of your tables. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask these panelists, we'd encourage you to begin to go ahead and think about that and write down your questions. Those will be collected, and we can ask our panelists. We would like to also welcome Nicole Daly. She is going to be our moderator for this panel session. Each of them will be presenting a brief introductory remarks or a presentation, talking a little bit about what they do and associated with the TMDL compliance. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Nicole.